I think we can start this time. You agree? You have been waiting for this to begin. My name is Kerstin Barnd, and I am here as the director of the Museum Studies program who invited Bénédicte Savoy. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literature. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, which are the Museum of Art, UMA, the building we are in, the university's African Studies Center, and the university's Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. And I would also like to thank my Museum Studies team, Amy Smoller and Associate Director Deirdre Hennebury, for the support of making this happen.
I'm not sure your mic is doing anything.
The mic is not on?
I can hear you.
Is the mic on now? Yeah, okay. This event has been a long time in the making. And here we are, COVID be damned. I couldn't be happier, and I'm thrilled and honored that I finally get to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Bénédicte Savoy, and that I get to do so in person. It felt almost miraculous to tour UMA's Wish You Were Here exhibit earlier today with Bénédicte Savoy, UMA curator Ozi Uduma, and researcher Caitlin Webster. Deirdre was also part of the group. And if you haven't seen the exhibit resonates very much with today's talk. It's on the first floor. Go and see it, and you will see that Bénédicte is part of that, and Bénédicte's work has been an inspiration and is part of the exhibit. Bénédicte Savoy is an art historian, a public intellectual, and a historian of museum and collecting. She's a polyglot and peripatetic. A true European at home in two cities, Berlin, Germany, and Paris, France. At the Technical University of Berlin, she's professor of modern art history and currently serves as chair of the Department of History of Art. In Paris, she holds a consecutive professorship at the Collège de France for the cultural history of European art from the 18th to 20th centuries. Both Germany and France have bestowed on her prestigious prizes for her academic accomplishments. In 2015, she received both the Prix de l'Académie de Berlin, and they actually used the French for that prize, and the Prix du rayonnement de la langue et de la littérature française of the Académie Française. And in 2016, she received the Gottfried Leibniz Prize in Germany. Bénédicte Savoy studied German language and civilization as well as history of art in France and received her doctorate from the University of Paris with a dissertation on the cultural heritage looted in Germany by French troops during the Napoleonic Wars. This project led to her first book on Napoleon's looting of German art, entitled Kunstraub, Napoleons Konfiszierungen in Deutschland und die europäischen Folgen. And this book was first published in French in 2003 and in German in 2010. Around the same time, she curated a closely related French-German exhibition project for the National Kunst- und Ausstellungshalle in Bonn. That show was titled Napoleon and Europe, Dream and Trauma. The intersections of imperial warfare and global translocation of cultural heritage established in this very first project set her on a research path towards related and ever more far-reaching projects. From investigating and deconstructing the imperial myth of Napoleon and his era, she moved on to study the aura and imperial translocations of Nofretiti or Nofretete's bust, excavated in Egypt in 1913 by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt. Savoy's co-edited volume, Nofretiti, eine deutsch-französische Affäre, a German-French affair, 1912 to 1931, carefully places the bust in the imperial history of its time, the history and politics of archaeology and Egyptology, and the history and politics of the First World War. These first book projects already made clear that Bénédicte Savoy is a Grenzgängerin, a crosser of borders, in the best sense of the word. Not only does she habitually move geographically between Berlin and Paris and back to Berlin and to London, Zurich, Benin, and Ann Arbor in between, but she also straddles disciplinary boundaries in the most productive ways. While not an archaeologist herself, her museum historical method is one of excavation, an uncovering and unfolding of very specific histories, as well as the transnational bonds that connect museums and their cultures of collecting. She's passionate and persistent in the archival excavation and curation of heretofore neglected sources that bring into relief museum histories. In this vein, she co-edited a volume in 2010 on museum history that assembled and commented on historical source material about European museum history from 1750 to 1950. A subsequent anthology gathered accounts of international visitors to Berlin's Museum Island from 1830 to 1990. And her co-edited volume, Museum Visions, brought to light the discussions around the expansion of Berlin's Museum Island in 1883 and 1884, right at the time the museum district's new design for the 21st century started to open again. In a subsequent edited volume of essays, Tempel der Kunst, die Geburt des öffentlichen Museums in Deutschland, Bénédicte Savoy brought together new scholarship about the genesis of public museums in Germany and Europe in the 1700s. In her research about Berlin's Museum Island, Bénédicte came across films about the Berlin museums and their collections in the 1930s that were produced by Nazi curators and filmmakers. These finds prompted her to take the medium of film seriously as a form of museum documentation, dissemination, and propaganda. This too led to a fascinating publication, though, as is the case with most of her other books, I'm afraid that the fruits of this research are so far only available to the German reader or the reader of German or French. Happily, however, this is beginning to change, as you will see in a minute. Given Professor Savoy's wide-ranging expertise, it now seems almost inevitable that eventually the government would come calling. Several years ago, French President Emmanuel Macron commissioned Bénédicte Savoy and the Senegalese scholar Felvine Sarr to study the publicly owned French collections of African artworks originating from illicit or otherwise disputed acquisitions, and to propose a plan for eventual restitution. Published in 2018, the report, The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage Toward a Relational Ethics, was globally celebrated and critiqued for its broad vision and clear stance towards restitution. The plea for more thorough inventories and restitutions are based in Sarr's and Savoy's devastating assessment that 90% of all cultural heritage from sub-Saharan Africa remain in the possession of collections in the global north. Guided by the outspokenness, the courage of its two authors, and the activism that preceded and then continued to be inspired by the report, touched a nerve and rippled throughout Europe, Africa, and North America. Slowly but surely, the discourse on restitution began to materialize in actual plans to bring looted artworks back to their African home countries. While in Berlin and at the city's newly established Humboldt Forum, Savoy had first encountered fierce rejection for her calls for more provenance research and open-mindedness about restitution. We now see government-sponsored efforts to return the Benin bronzes held in many public museums in Germany to Nigeria. In France and in Belgium, laws have been passed in favor of the return of African artifacts that were until now considered French and Belgian patrimony. A new research project on the restitution of knowledge, artifacts as archives in the Postcolonial Museum brings together researchers in Oxford and Berlin and is led by Bénédicte Savoy and Dan Hicks at Oxford's, who works at and for Oxford's Pitt Rivers Museum. And the expanding circles generated by Bénédicte's work on all of these fronts do not end here. One of her own projects in this regard has concerned the prehistory of our current moment. Her research led to the publication of yet another monograph last year, and I couldn't be more pleased to note that this one just came out and is available in English translation. Bénédicte, and so it is here, and we still have a few copies available for purchase after the talk. Bénédicte's talk today, entitled Africa's Struggle for Its Art, History of a Postcolonial Defeat, 1965 to 1985, draws from this work, and we'll have, I already said that we have a few copies, right? So for now, though, please help me welcome Bénédicte Savoy to the podium.
Thank you very much for your generous presentation. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I was completely excited today morning to see this museum, these absolutely amazing exhibitions, in plural, and the displays, the permanent display of your collections. I had the sensation to be in the future of the museum history from the Berlin perspective, because in Berlin our museums are a little bit boring. So thank you very, very much for your invitation. I'm very grateful to you, Kerstin, to the Museum Studies program, and to the UMA Museum to have the opportunity to speak here with you. As you can see, English is not one of my working languages. I'm a little bit tense right now. The reason why it is like that is that I grew up in France in a time when France developed a very strong anti-Americanism. It was called anti-colonialism because France had the fear to be colonized culturally by the popular culture, by Hollywood, by rock and roll, etc. And it was not very convenient for parents to let their children learn English. I've learned German and Italian, and we have the result now. I feel a little bit disabled, but I will try it, and I hope you can bear it. Working on the so-called Savoy report during the year 2018 brought many insights for Felwine Sarr on the left and myself. One of them was a physical experience of something, what I will show you in 1 minute, but the reason, I think Kerstin told it, but I have to remember that this mission, this report, was a result of speech by Emmanuel Macron, where 5 years ago, when he was a young president, he was a new president. I think he was 39 years old. It was the youngest president in French history, and he had a strange speech in Ouagadougou, Africa, Burkina Faso. And after 2.5 hours of speaking in front of 800 students from Burkina Faso, outside there were huge protests against France, because France is not very popular in the former French Africa. he said at the end of this speech, I want to have restitution of African works of art. Je ne peux pas accepter qu'une large part du patrimoine culturel, sorry, the translation is coming, but I have to read the French one. Je ne peux pas accepter qu'une large part du patrimoine culturel de plusieurs pays africains soit en France. Il y a des explications historiques à cela, mais il n'y a pas de justification valable, durable et inconditionnelle. Le patrimoine africain ne peut pas être uniquement dans des collections privées et des musées européens. I cannot accept that a large part of the cultural heritage of several African countries is in France, etc., etc. I want that we would have restitution between 5 years. 5 years because is now, because he's his time as a politician. And after that, we would ask Felwine Sarr and myself to write a report about the possibilities of giving back this African cultural heritage. And we said in this report, after having worked 8 months on that, yes, you have to restitute and to restitute now and without conditions. So working on this report brought many insights. One of them was a physical experience of the absence of cultural heritage on the one hand and of their presence and in other locations. You can see here the empty palace of Abomey in today's Republic of Benin, and here you see the objects plundered in this location by the French army in 1892 in the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac in Paris, and this experience of seeing the empty palace on a Thursday and after having a night flight after 20 hours to see the objects in Paris was a very strong experience. You can make this experience mentally in museums. You can think, okay, when I have something here, because it's one unique work of art, piece of art, it must be absent from another place, but to have this experience physically, it's very strong. Another insight was a historical experience, a closer look at the colonial history of African collections in the world, but also and mostly in France. Here you can see the number of African objects in the inventories of public museums worldwide. And the great imbalance between Europe and the rest of the world. A third insight was into how collective memory works. The project took us into a large number of archives in Paris. Once we were there, we were surprised to find that the work we were doing at that time, 2018, and the restitution debate we were witnessing had actually happened before. To be precise, at the end of the 1970s. You can see here different documents from this period that I found in the archive of the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. It was completely unknown at that time. And here I found later in different archives in Germany other evidence for this first debate. In the political archives of the Foreign Office, for example, Auswärtiges Amt in Berlin, or in museums archives like in Stuttgart, Linden Museum in the right corner, and of course also in the UK. You can see here some newspaper excerpts from the Londoner Times. And even in the USA, here's another spectacular example from 1974. Please take a few seconds to look closely at this cover of the Africa Report published by the New York African American Institute. It shows a baby-sized African statue looking for a seat in an empty airplane, and directly above it, in white letters, this hesitant question, will African art ever go home again? All this archive material provided us evidence that the current restitution debate had already taken place 50 years before we, Felwin and I, worked on it. It was a shock. We were a little bit depressive after that. We noticed that this debate was genuinely transnational. It was not only a French debate or a German debate, but it was in the North. It was our first thought in the global North. And this debate was very advanced at that time. This earlier restitution debate and its sinking into complete collective oblivion resembles in many ways today's debate on climate change, which also already existed at the end of the 90s. In this great book, Losing Earth, of 2019, the New York novelist Nathaniel Rich reconstructs the failure of the steps that were taken at the time. Why we didn't act on climate when we had the chance, and this chance was around 1979 in this is his discovery. So I imitate Nathaniel Rich and tried to reconstruct the first restitution debate, and this book was first published in German under the title Afrikas Kampf seine Kunst. In English, Africa's Struggle for its Art, History of a Postcolonial Defeat, translated by the brilliant translator Susanne Meyer-Abich. One of the most important discoveries of this book is that nearly every conversation today about the restitution of cultural property to Africa already happened 40 years ago. Nearly every relevant film had already been made, and nearly every demand had already been formulated. Even the most recent viral videos on social media about the spectacular taking back of artworks from museums, as filmed on mobile phones in France and Belgium in the summer of 2020 by Congolese activist Emery Mwazula Diabansa, had already been scripted in many minds by the mid-1970s, etc., etc. In today's presentation, I would like to address two things. Firstly, this phenomenon of double amnesia concerning the restitution of cultural property to Africa, and secondly, the fact that restitutions are not an invention of today's politically correct Europeans. We heard a lot of that. Oh, restitutions, it's your topic, it's something for woke people, for bored European people and academics. But in reality, the truth is that this issue was and is very much linked to the Pan-African independence movements and to decolonization in the 60s and 70s. My presentation today is divided into three short chapters: Reconnections, in word and film, and solidarity or no solidarity among professionals. But let me start point zero with the phenomenon of oblivion I mentioned before: amnesia, aphasia. Nowadays, we are not only suffering from colonial amnesia in Europe when we are dealing with the history of African collections in our museums in Paris, London, or Berlin, we have also forgotten entirely that this debate already took place 50 years ago. Now, it is hard for historians to reconstruct the mechanism of forgetting because written sources are often absent to document the forgetting. and silence and unspoken words are rarely documented. That's why I was very happy to find a short TV document which I would like to share with you now. We go back to the year 1978 to the news program on the French state television channel TF1, Télévision France 1. It featured the anchor Roger Giquel on the subject of restitution. Millions of French people listened in, even children, because we had only 2 channels in France at that time. Even children, as I was at that time. Giquel referred to a speech by the Director General of UNESCO in favor of restitutions. Then came the following words. Oops, we need sound. I'm sorry, Ryan.
L'information que je viens de vous donner est l'appel du directeur
Oops,
général
but
de l'UNESCO, M. Legault, pour que
I'm sorry.
reviennent dans leur pays d'origine les œuvres d'art qu'ils ont perdues dans des circonstances de l'histoire qu'ils...
I'm sorry. So, now I'm very happy to share this little video clip with you, and you can imagine you are one of millions of French people in the 70s, in the late 70s. I was very young at that time. Okay, now.
Mais quelles circonstances, quel fossé entre cette information que je viens de vous donner et l'appel du directeur général de l'UNESCO, M. Mbeau, pour que reviennent dans leur pays d'origine les œuvres d'art qu'ils ont perdues dans des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire.
What does this sequence from a French news program of 1978 tell us? Firstly, it confirms that the subject of restitution was already widely discussed in public. Secondly, and above all, that there were clearly something hidden behind the spoken words, which could not be voiced quite so easily. Let's listen again.
Constance de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire.
Roger Giquel, whose hands usually remain calmly on the table, at that point underlines his phrase with a strange hand movement in the air. His gaze, which is normally directed straight at the camera, is lowered for a moment. Des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire. What we see here is, so to speak, historical repression as live action. I was 6 years old at that time. What could children then, the adults of today, understand from this sentence and this gesture? What could children understand of this explicit call for not knowing and not wanting to know? What historical circumstances were at stake? For the adults of that time, for my parents, for my grandparents, for our teachers at school, the message was clear. He referred to the time of colonialism, when France systematically appropriated not only mineral and natural resources, but also cultural objects in the territories it administered. At that time, 1978, this colonial period was present in many French biographies and memories. The Algerian War and the war in Indochina were still in everyone's memory. So a short hint was enough. Let's not talk about it, we already know. This was not really colonial amnesia, rather something like aphasia, or a conspiracy of silence, Verschwörung des Schweigens, as one might say in German. I prefer to speak of a family secret. For the adults among us, the brief hint was enough. They knew. For us children, the sentence meant nothing. So we had to do the memory work by ourselves. That is where we are today. Reconnections. Now, let's go back to the year 1960. In this so-called Year of Africa, 18 former colonies in Africa gained their independence, together with membership status at the United Nations. You see here when the flags of these African countries were hoisted outside the United Nations headquarters in New York in September 60. In December 60, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence, also known as a Resolution 1514. With it, the World Organization committed to the right to self-determination for all nations, including and explicitly with regard to culture. Paragraph 3 dealt with possible delaying tactics of the colonial powers, especially with regard to preconditions for independence. This phrase has particular resonance in the current context, where the issue of restitution is often linked to the premise of the building of infrastructure of our museums in Africa. This sentence is: inadequacy of political, economic, social, or educational preparedness should never serve as a pretext for delaying independence. In Africa, the first restitution claims were published just a few years after 1960. You can see here the first major article devoted to this issue that I know of. It is entitled Rendez-nous l'art nègre. It was published in Dakar, in Bingo, a monthly magazine widely read in Francophone Africa and the African diaspora. Its author was the editor of Bingo, Paulin Joachim, you can see him, a respected poet and journalist, and yes, Rendez-nous l'art nègre, sorry, the translation is Give Negro Art Back to Us, and that's the cover of Bingo, this magazine. And yes, here you can see Paulin Joachim, the author. He appears in an official photograph of the famous Paris Congress of Black Artists and Writers in 1956. He was a very important figure of the Black Paris movement of the 60s and 50s. Joachim's editorial began with an explicit call to arms. Il est une bataille qu'il nous faudra vaillamment livrer sur tous les fronts de l'Europe et de l'Amérique, la bataille de la récupération de nos œuvres d'art disséminées à travers le monde. He recalls that Europeans have long presented Africans as people without history and without culture. Nous avons été longtemps présentés comme un peuple sans culture ni passé. La récupération légitime de nos arts plastiques pourra bouter le feu à ce mensonge historique. Nous avons besoin de consistance pour le chemin qui nous reste à parcourir. He deconstructs the legitimizing rhetoric of the colonial powers who translocates works of art to Europe. Nous avons pillé pour préserver les productions artistiques du monde noir, des vers et des termites. We plundered in order to save the artistic output of the black world from worms and termites. And he denounces this rhetoric as lies and excuses. Le bel alibi que voilà, la dialectique brillante que l'Europe a toujours su servir à ses interlocuteurs, mais personne aujourd'hui, en Afrique, ne se laisse plus prendre à ce marché de dupes. At this point, it is important to highlight that such Pan-African ideas were not only present in Africa and in the diasporas, but also widely disseminated in Europe in the following decades. Here again, a TV feature from 1984. You see a screenshot of a 3-hour talk show on restitution that takes place on the second German state broadcaster ZDF, Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen. Again, millions of viewers listened in. The ambiente is very interesting, this neo-colonial setting with plastic trees and little boat houses from the Pacific area. And in this 3-hour-long talk show, they invited 14 experts on restitutions or museum collection history. One of the guests was the ethnologist Tirmiziou Diallo from Guinea, and his language was very clear. Oops, we need the sound again.
Unsere Kultur wieder zu entdecken, der man uns sozusagen bis dahin enthalten hatte, und zwar auf zweierlei Ebenen. Einmal auf der theoretischen Ebene und andermal auf der konkreten, indem man uns das weggenommen hat. Und ich denke, man sollte einen Weg finden, in dem soweit von den Ländern verlangt wird, die Objekte, die für unsere weitere Entwicklung, kulturelle Entwicklung wichtig sind, zurückgegeben werden.
These historical sources are very interesting because you have silences. After this statement by Tirmiziou Diallo, in this stage you had 30 seconds nothing. And it's very interesting to reconstruct such aphasia or amnesia, phenomenon of amnesia, etc., because yes, something like that are not in written texts, obviously. Again, we have here the link between restitution and self-determination, and at least by the mid-80s, this one was 1884, the European public was very well informed about this issue. Part 2, in word and film. We are familiar, and the exhibition here shows a little clip from Black Panther. We are familiar with recent films, such Black Panther from 2018, produced by Marvel Studios, or the Nollywood production Invasion 1897 by Lancelot Odua Imasuen, which play with the plot of energetically taking back objects from museums to Africa. I think maybe you don't know Invasion 1897. It's a very interesting movie about our topic from 2014. It begins in London, and we need, yes. Okay, we are familiar with this idea of taking back with violence objects from museums, but we forget that even such plots were already being made in the 1970s. And the idea of violent repossession was already present in many creative minds at that time. I would like to give 2 examples of that. The first example is a black and white film called You Hide Me, directed by the Ghanaian Nii Kwate Owu. This 20-minute black and white film was Owu's graduation project at the London Film School. It's from 1970. The camera accompanies a young black man and woman through the basement of the British Museum and shows them unwrapping African objects from boxes and plastic bags. The whole film is accompanied by a voice-over in English with a strong African accent. the commentator describes the violent provenance of the objects in terms of loot and sack. He speaks of their invisible captivity in boxes and plastic bags, and condemns the systematic intended destruction of cultural, religious, and artistic traditions in Africa by colonial administrations. He also speaks of the ideological instrumentalization of African collections in Europe and the United States. The film ends, that's the filmmaker, Nyi Kwate Owu himself. The film ends with an urgent appeal. And I hope it will work. Okay. It's
of Africa and of African descent demand that our works of art, which embody our culture, our history, and our civilization, should immediately be returned to us.
The British Museum in itself is part of...
Sorry. It's the next slide. I don't know why. Okay. It will come. Yes, this film, You Hide Me, was a pointed political attack against the presence, deemed useless, of African cultural goods in the storage of British and other museums. Unseen in the West and inaccessible for Africans, the objects shown in the film appear as an enormous capital hoarded in the basement of the museum, twice buried in the collective unconsciousness of both African and European societies. This film was only a work by a student, but it had a huge career in festivals worldwide, in France, in the Soviet Union, but also in Africa, and it became a kind of pamphlet for restitution in artistic form. Another example of artistic engagement transports us to Nigeria in the 70s. You can see here the young writer Wole Soyinka from South Africa, who was awarded by the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986. In his memoirs, Soyinka reports that in 1977, he recommended to the Nigerian government that instead of negotiating with the British authorities about possible restitution without any prospect of success, it would be better to send a kind of military commando to London. What I proposed instead was that a task force of specialists in such matters, including foreign mercenaries if necessary, be set up to bring back the treasure and as many others as possible in one swift, once-for-all time, coordinated operation. Whether Wole Soyinka really made this suggestion in the mid-1970s can hardly be verified. However, it is clear that the motive he described, a robust grab to bring home African objects from European museums, became a popular narrative in pop and artistic culture up to today. At the famous Pan-African festival FestAC 77 in Lagos, Nigeria, the so-called Queen Idia mask, which had been stolen by the British in 1897 and taken to the British Museum, became a symbol of European arrogance. This short video now shows how it was present everywhere in Lagos in reproduction, while the British Museum refused to lend the original mask, which remained in London up to today. We can have a look on this Queen Idia mask. It's a little, it's an object from 20 centimeter high in the British Museum now, and Nigeria tried to obtain a loan only for the period of the festival, but it didn't. The British Museum was not able to say yes. say only no. And I want to show you how the Nigerian reacted to these refuse. So. The Festtag 77 was the most important cultural event of the 20th century, I would say. It was not only important for Africa, but also for our world culture. And this topic of restitution, or of the arrogance of English museums, but European museums, not to give, to lend, to be able to give something only for a few weeks, become, through the omnipresence of the Queen Idia mask, a very discussed topic, not only in Nigeria, but in all the newspapers who reported about this Festtag. Oh, yes, here's another example of, it's a cover of shellac music. You have one in your exhibition here. And here's the original of this piece of ivory from the 16th century in the British Museum collection online database now. Part 3, no solidarity among professionals. As early as 1979, the important German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung called restitution a specter in European Museum. Seit etwa 6 Jahren geht ein Gespenst in europäischen Museen, kurz Restitution genannt. Gemeint ist damit eine Rückkehr von musealen Objekten in ihre Ursprungsländer, wie sie in der UNESCO gefordert worden ist, auf Verlangen einer Gruppe schwarzafrikanischer Staaten. It was a transformation of Karl Marx's very famous sentence about communism as a specter in Europe, but here the specter was disturbing the European museums. And one reason why restitutions failed at that time had indeed to do with the resistance of Western museums. I can show you another evidence for that. It's an excerpt of the Times in London with this highlighting that museums are not willing to be transparent with the publication of inventories of lists, etc. Now I would like to end with this resistance of museums in Europe, which is still with us today. You can see here the archaeologist Ekpo Eyo from Nigeria, the leading museum voice in the struggle for restitution from the late 60s to the 80s. Ekpo Eyo was the first African archaeologist He did his PhD at Cambridge in the UK, and he was a very respected scholar, a colleague, a normal museum colleague, so to speak. His first official attempts that I could find in European archives to bring back artworks from Africa to Africa is a letter from the German Foreign Office to the Berlin Museum from May 1972, stating, der Direktor des Department of Antiquities im Federal Ministry of Education, Mr. Egbo Eyo, hat die Botschaft mithilfe bei der Rückführung einiger im deutschen Besitz befindlicher Bronzestücke gebeten. Egbo Eyo möchte einige wenige Stücke als permanente Leihgabe nach Nigeria zurückbekommen. You notice, they were only talking about a few pieces and permanent loans, not about taking back all the stuff the British, the German, the French, etc. had appropriated. This request also went to other museums in Europe, to Vienna and London, for example. In all these museums, the reactions were negative. And I would now like to conclude by showing you some of the arguments that were formulated in Europe at the time. First example, Stuttgart. You see Friedrich Kussmaul, director of the Linden Museum in the 70s, who writes statements like this in official letters to the Ministry of Culture in his region. In Kreisen afrikanischer Intelligenz ist ein manchmal übersteigertes Gefühl eigener Würde, Leistung, Tradition und Zusammengehörigkeit entstanden. Wir sollten gemischte Kommissionen aus europäischen und amerikanischen Museumsleuten die sollen in Afrika arbeiten, Zitat, da nur in diesem Fall eine kenntnisreiche, zuverlässige Grundlage zu schaffen sei. The first statement was a clearly racist argument coupled with the formulation of epistemic and methodological white superiority. So a real negation of the competencies and also the striving for self-determination of African colleagues. You have to see that, to know that Friedrich Kussmaul had never been to Africa. It had never been outside of Baden-Württemberg. It's a little region in Germany, and he was born in Böblingen. It's 30 kilometers from Stuttgart, and he worked in Stuttgart. So he had no idea about Africa, but he had this very this authority of an expert to say or to formulate such statements. And the politicians, the government of Baden-Württemberg was needed to have the statements of experts. So these kind of statements were very politically very important and very destructive. Example 2, we are in Berlin now, in West Berlin in the 70s. You can see here the president of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, the foundation for the Prussian cultural heritage. You know, Prussia was disappeared after the Second World War, 1945, but the museums and the libraries and the archives from Prussia had to exist still exist, and they invented this foundation of the Prussian cultural heritage without Prussia. The first president and all the inventors of this foundation were former Nazis, and also this man called Hans-Georg Wormit on the left-hand side, and the other one is the Director General of the State Museums of Berlin, Stefan Wetzold. Here, in these circles, a recurring motif was that the demands from Africa were not cultural, but political and nationalistic. Es ist unverantwortlich, dem Nationalismus von Entwicklungsländern nachzugeben. He said in one of these letters, the nice thing in West German archives at that time is that even when they called at phone, they wrote protocols. And you have all these discussions and these conversations in archives. That's only one sentence, but we have a lot of evidence for these accusing the others to be nationalistic in a time when Berlin West was very nationalist against Berlin East in the Cold War. In Germany, museum opposition was effective to organize. Among other things, these professionals, Kussmaul and these guys, formulated an internal paper containing several pages of guidelines about how to deal with the restitution claims. I would just like to mention 3 of these good ideas from museums. First, the first one is that. Da eine Rechtspflicht zur Rückgabe nach den bestehenden Gesetzen nicht vorliegt, muss der Begriff Restitution abgewehrt werden. Sonst entsteht dadurch der Eindruck juristisch unsauberen Erwerbs. Der Begriff Restitution, Rückgabe, muss so weit gefasst werden, dass keine moralische Verpflichtung zu erkennen ist. Dies ist der Ausgangspunkt jeder weiteren Erörterung. In die Diskussion einen neuen Begriff wurde Transfer eingebracht. It's very interesting because restitution is a taboo word, and when Emmanuel Macron spoke about restitution, it was the first time after maybe 200 years that a French statesman or a politician used this word. And the reason why it was taboo is that restitution encapsulates history. You have restitution means to restore, or that you have a history and something it happened and you have to restore that. And transfer or circulation, the other terms, are without history. They are horizontal, so to speak, and restitution is vertical in the timeline. Another point was Emotionalität, emotions. The museum professionals recognized that emotions are against them because the public was morally on the side of African countries. Trotz der für die Emotionalität, Okay, in the question of return of cultural assets, our museums must expect to come under increasing public, respectively moral pressure. The countries of the Third World are determined to regain their cultural assets and present them at home. This is a largely emotional process that cannot be controlled. And the idea after that was, because if it's so emotional, we have to answer in legal terms, only speaking about legality or illegality of acquisitions, but not going in this emotional direction. And it's very strange because museums or patrimony, the cultural heritage, art is emotional. And it's almost impossible to separate art, religious items, etc., from these emotions. And they had to understand, okay, emotions are very dangerous for us. And the third very dangerous thing in the discussion for the German museum at that time were the transparency of inventories. They understand that if they will publish their collections, everybody would know what they have. And it was a big danger. Objektverzeichnisse. Vor der Erstellung solcher Listen wird sowohl von Seiten unserer Völkerkundemuseen als auch der Kulturverwaltungen gewarnt. So würden Begehrlichkeiten erst recht geweckt. And this sentence or this paragraph is the reason why we have no inventories in Berlin until now for the Humboldt Forum, for example. And it's not it's not incapacity to do inventories. The museums have inventories, but it was too dangerous from the 70s on to publish them because of these claims, and I was very happy to find these clue to understand the today's situation in Berlin. As a reverse conclusion, these guidelines suggest what we must do today: insist on the term restitution and not replace it through circulation or something else. Take emotions seriously and demand transparency about holdings. My last example of museum opposition comes from London. I'll show you a brief excerpt from a TV interview from 1981 with David Wilson, the then director of the British Museum, also an outspoken opponent of restitution, and his argument is very emotional, and it's strange how to see how somebody with this strength, this British voice and accent and his jacket, etc., can be so emotional against restitution. You will see it. My copy is not very good, but I think you can understand his argument.
In itself,
sorry, we need
British
it.
Museum in itself is part of world culture. It is a major part of world culture. If you start to destroy the British Museum by taking things away from it, it's as bad as if you blow up the Parthenon.
This documentary is also a very good example by on BBC in the 80s of the huge visibility of this discussion in Europe at that time. Let me conclude. My presentation focused on African voices in the 70s, but it ended with the voice of white museum directors 40 years ago. Where are we now? When we spoke with politicians in Africa, with Felwine Sarr in 2018, the former Ministry of Culture in today Republic of Benin, Oswald Omeki, said, "I don't believe in restitution, and if restitution takes place, it would be like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the reunification of both Koreas." It was a manner to say, I don't believe in restitutions, but if they happen, it will bring a complete new geopolitical order of the African cultural heritage. And now, I would say the wall has fallen. On the 10th of November 2021, France gave back 26 monumental objects from Abomey, who had been looted by the French army in 1892. For Benin, for the Republic of Benin, it was a historical, and also for France, it's an historic event. You can see here in this very typical way of having a newspaper in Cotonou, in Benin. Benin is a country next to Nigeria, west to Nigeria. Historique, transfert de propriété de 26 trésors royaux d'Abomey. It was a huge day, a very important day, and it was like the fall of the Berlin Wall for the geopolitical, for the geography of the cultural heritage from Africa. The New York Times reported on that, and also Korean newspapers. And I want to show you a little bit how the mood was in Cotonou at that day. I was there with Felwine Sarr when the lorries came back with the boxes, with the huge boxes with these treasures, royal treasures. Oops. That's the road between the airport and the presidential palace in Cotonou. That's Felwin, Sar. It was very impressive to see how the population was involved in this return, was happy about that. Yes, because I had all these stereotypes in my head, like African people are not interested in art, they have no idea about museums, etc. And it was exactly opposite of that. It was a warm welcoming from the patrimoine back, like lost children who are coming back after 130 years. The ceremony was only about the taking out these huge boxes from the lorry in November. And you can see here it's an iconography like the birth, the rebirth of the cultural heritage. This scene took maybe 10 minutes. It was very carefully, and the baby, the returned throne of Béanzin, of the king of Dahomey, came very slowly out. And then they had to, these boxes had to, or these treasures had to wait for 3 months in order to reacclimate themselves. And on the 20th of February, 1 month ago, a huge exhibition opened with recovered treasures. I show you the entry of the traditional kings. You have this mix, this very typical mix between the European representatives of the Republic of Benin, this democracy. It's Patrice Talon, the president, and his Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the other ones are the traditional kings. And it was very moving and touching to see how they were able to reconnect with their own history. Here they are coming into the exhibition. And this exhibition has a very clear language about colonization and restitution and the connection between both of them, colonization and restitution. It's the first part, but the second part is a show about contemporary art in Benin today. And for me, it was very interesting, or it is very interesting to see how the old cultural heritage now will give energy for today, for the contemporary art, and for the future. I can show you these traditional kings with the curator of this part of the exhibition. And here on the right side, you have beautiful helmets with cowries by Emo de Medeiros. He's a young Beninese artist. And this situation of traditional kings in an exhibition for contemporary art connected to the old art, it's exactly what we were expecting with Felwine Sarr when we said you have the return will bring something new, and these new things are not known now, but we need to provoke them and to be to be welcoming the new. I don't know how to formulate that, but for me now, for my temporality and in my work, I can say the Berlin Wall has fallen, indeed, and I'm happy that although all these old facts from the 70s and 80s, yes, you spoke from activism, but I think in my case it's more factivism, or these highlighting or taking into light of all these old documents were something like a weapon, and it worked. And I'm very happy about that. But I can show you how this decision could have been taken in the 80s when I was a little girl, because at the end of this program, of this TV program I showed you before, Roger Giquel said exactly the same what we are saying now, namely
les identités publiques. Préserver ce patrimoine artistique et donc quelquefois le restituer, il faut bien se plier à ça. Bonne soirée à tous, au nom de toute l'équipe du TF1, dernier journal Jacques Pousse, 23h30.
Thank you very much.
Want to speak up?
Sure.
Johannes?
Can I use the mic?
You can also use the mic, yes.
And it works, yeah. So thank you for your factivism. Thank you for the forensic work and these incredible stories. I mean, it's really amazing to hear this. And you couldn't make up those sources. I mean... I have a question about sources on the whether in all the echoes that you trace, there's also an echo of your own report, because I saw in the New York, in the London Times they refer to UNESCO report on restitution. So was there already a report in the 70s on how this should be handled, which then the German UNESCO, because you also had that document from the German UNESCO, which then the German UNESCO office contravened? Did they undo what the UNESCO was saying? Could you talk about UNESCO?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. It's true, the UNESCO played a very important role, but not the UNESCO. At the UNESCO, one particular person, and he was Amadou Makhtar, the first general director from the UNESCO who was coming from Africa, from Dakar, Senegal. And Amadou Makhtar decided to make this restitution issue to a Chefsache in German, to a main topic for UNESCO. And he gave a speech, a very important speech. In this exhibition in Cotonou, you have exactly here, in the next wall, all this speech by Amadou Makhtar from 1978, and it was a very humanistic speech about why is culture so important for people, for populations, and for young countries after the independence. So it was not a report, it was a speech, but this speech was translated into 50 languages and sent all over the world. You have also videos of this speech and etc., audios. And the German Deutsche UNESCO-Kommission, the German UNESCO Commission, was afraid. And they, how do you say, they shoot in the legs, in the back, of the UNESCO doing all these secret, you say maybe vertraulich, absolutely secret, etc., doing this secret work against the restitution project. And in this Deutsche UNESCO Commission, there were a lot of older or former Nazi. And it's not a very big surprise because the continuity in the 60s and 70s in the Bundesrepublik in Germany, the continuity with the Nazi era are known, but also in this museum world. It's not only in the Innenministerium or Finanzministerium, etc. And yes.
Yeah. Kayla. Here you go.
Okay, great.
Wow.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I had a question about the mood of the French museums currently when it comes to restitution. We know that many museums even now still now, are very hesitant or defensive when it comes to restitution. Have you felt that something is changing in the museums, specifically in France, because of the report that you've written, or do you feel it's very, very slow?
Thank you very much. I've been living in Berlin for 25 years, so I can't observe exactly what is going on in France, but I can say the restitution of these 26 sounds a little bit like nothing, because Paris has 69,000 objects from Africa, south of the Sahara. So 26 sounds like nothing, but there are 26 very important objects, royal objects, very important for the Republic of Benin, of the today's Republic of Benin, but they were also very important for France because these objects were all the time in the 130 years on display in Paris, in the Musée d'ethnographie du Trocadéro, Musée de l'Homme, and now Musée du Quai Branly, where the star architect Jean Nouvel did a rotunda for them. And now this rotunda should be, or is not, but could be empty. It's not empty, I can say something about that. This particular restitution, is the work of the Musée du Quai Branly. They worked a lot, they worked hard in order to have a very good hand-in-hand return of object without emission, etc. I think but I would say it's a question of generations. You have younger generations in the museum. They are not only in this museum, in museums generally, and at universities, etc. They are completely pro-restitutions. And I'm always happy to see, when I speak about that with my students in Berlin, huge question marks in their eyes if you say, yes, in the 70s or until now, museums are against restitution, and they are asking, why? Why? So evident. And I think we have a huge shift of generation, and I think it's the same in Paris. But I think the museum is not very comfortable with this act of restitution. They did it very well, perfectly, I would say. On the Beninese side was perfect. But, for example, instead of letting this empty space empty and to deal with emptiness and the question of we have restituted something, it's a good act of us, and we could show you how these works are working in Cotonou, etc. It would be very interesting for the Parisian public, I would say. They put a huge sculpture from Nigeria, 6 meters high and 3 meters, a huge mask from Nigeria made by hundreds of little pieces of fabric, a beautiful piece, but this piece is like, it's a opposite of working with emptiness. It filled this empty space up without explanation, and maybe it's a sign for this discomfort of the Paris Museum. But I think, on the other hand, the museums in France are are aware about their role as the first European museums doing something like that. And Benin is the first African country with such success. And it's very interesting if you are in Cotonou to see how Nigeria, Ghana, all of them are observing Benin now. It's a role model. And Benin is a little country without natural resources, etc., but a lot of intellectual resources and diplomatical skills in order to achieve something like that.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. My cohort has done quite a few of your readings, so it's very exciting to be here. One argument that came up in this presentation, as well as the other readings, the counter-argument to restitution, rather, is that the museums or the countries in Africa don't have the museums or libraries or galleries or whatnot to safely store this, right, centering the safety of the object. Do you find in your research that this is actually a concern at a serious level? And if there is a place in Africa that were not to have, somewhere safe to keep them, safe determined by, the British Museum or whatnot, what steps could be taken in order to ensure that, the objects would be kept safe for generations of African visitors to continue to see?
I think I have two answers. The first one is when we worked with Felwin, we did an inventory of existing museums on the African continent. The African continent is huge, and you have a lot of different situations. You have very new museums, top modern museums like the Musée des Civilisations Noires in Dakar, which was built by the Chinese a few years ago, or in Kinshasa now you have modern museums, and you have countries without museums or with very poor museums. The situations are very different. But that's the first part of my answer. The second part is more historical. You said, Kerstin, I worked a lot on the Napoleonic era, and when France was obliged to give back all the works of art from Europe to, for example, to Berlin, to Prussia, Berlin didn't have a museum. And you start to think about museums when you have your cultural heritage, not in the time when your cultural heritage is away. And in Berlin, it lasts 50 years between the moment when the works of art turned back from Napoleon, from France, and the moment when they had the first public museum in Berlin. And it's 15 years of thinking about how should our museum looks like, etc. And in Africa, you have exactly the same discussions. In Nigeria, like now in Benin City, you have discussions between the state of Nigeria, the traditional king from Benin City, thinking about how to make this heritage public and to show it properly. I have a third answer. The third answer is also a result of our discussions with Felwinsar. Museums are only one possibility of displaying works of art in Africa. It's a nice possibility, and you can see it in Cotonou now, the museum. It's not a museum, it's the former presidential palace that had been transformed into a huge exhibition hall. It's one possibility, but you have a lot of other possibilities. For some objects, religious, sacred objects, you have, in some situations, these religions still exist, and you can recharge the objects, or you can invent something else. So, and I think it's very important to think about other epistemologies, other Wissensordnungen, other possibilities to show your cultural heritage. We have not only this one. Yes. Thank you.
Any other questions? David?
Thank you for a most insightful, stunning, and inspiring opening of mind. I was wondering from your perspective about how museums that are in possession do or don't create long-term multi-generational relationships with the communities and cultures and artists of origin of the loot that they once or still hold.
Thank you very much. Yes, these interacting with artists, with filmmakers, with musicians, choreographers from the communities of origin are, in Germany, for example, are turning very common. It's more and more normal to do that. In the Humboldt Forum, you have a lot of invitations from Namibian artists or Tanzanian artists to do something in these spaces. But for our interlocutors in Africa with Felwinsar, it was always very important to clarify the question of ownership. And maybe you have noticed that here, what is historical is the transfert de propriété, the transfer of ownership. It's not to have the things there if they are the property of France. It's not interesting. The interesting thing is to have it. And the reason, one of the reasons, I think it's not a nationalistic reason. It's also, it has a lot to do with this geopolitical networks of museums. If you have own collections, you are able to play with the other big museums. For example, if Paris want to have a Leonardo from the Vatican museums, the Vatican museums will say, okay, you can have our Leonardo, but we want your Raphael next year. And now, if these countries have their own collections, they will not now, because now they are very happy to have it, and I'm pretty sure it will take a time to begin with loans, etc. But they have the possibility to say, okay, you can have our royal things in Paris and interact with the diasporas of Benin in Paris if you want, but give us a Picasso or a Delacroix or Géricault or I don't know what. And so you are completely right. It is ongoing, and it is important to have these interactions because the diasporas are also very powerful in Europe, and they need to have this contact with their culture. But it can't be instead of restitution. And in Germany, for example, in Berlin, it was a strategy, or it is a strategy to invite a lot of people in order not to speak about restitution. You see, you can curate your own cultural heritage, etc. And these strategies are very subtle. Subtle? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was just a wonderful presentation. I guess I have a question about sort of the issue of modern nation states and ownership versus kind of cultural heritage that pertains to sort of groups that cut across multiple modern boundaries, and what position you take on those kinds of issues.
In my sources, in my articles, etc., what I see was almost only a Pan-African discourse in Africa. It wasn't national, it was Pan-African. Pan-Africanism is not a nationalism, it's something else, and is not only about Africa, but also about the diasporas worldwide. And my impression is, or was, working on these sources, that the accusation of being a nationalist was made by the most nationalistic museums in Europe, the British Museum, the German Museum in the context of the Cold War, and even in Benin now, seeing these restitutions here and listening to Patrice Talon, to his speeches when he will welcome the works back, it was not nationalistic. It was more about how a society can need its history in order to continue to remain innovative, etc., to shape its future. And I was very touched to it's not about le Bénin, une nation forte, etc., because, no, it was absolutely about we need to know our history in order to communicate it to our children, and because our history is our it's like a power food to continue to be a good society, a democratic society. And yes, okay, it's a little bit nationalistic if you think that democracy or praising democracy is a form of nationalism. But I think I take it seriously with this cultural need to reconnect. And I think in Benin, it's a region, and I would say in Nigeria, you have different voices, but I think it's mainly about cultural needs. I hope so.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bénédicte. And you can come up. You know, the students who have purchased books, we have another book here, I think. If you want Bénédicte to sign your book, just come on up. And she's happy to do that. That was great. Das ist toll.
Okay.
Ja,
Ja.
Es funktioniert.
Es wird immer besser.
Es funktioniert.
Ja.